Judge Boyd had always been known for his level-headedness and impeccable reputation. For years, boydâ been a respected member of the community, known not just for his knowledge of the law, but for his unwavering commitment to fairness and justice. Yet, one simple mistake, a single lapse in judgment, would unravel everything he had worked for. It began with a Snapchat. He didn't understand the platform fully, but it had become part of the modern digital age that even people in his position had to acknowledge. A quick message to a friend, just a few words exchanged, no big deal. Or so he thought. The contents of the message, meant to be private, were never intended for the public eye. But someone had taken a screenshot, and before Boyd could blink, it was out there for the world to see. It wasn't just the words that caused the firestorm. It was the context, the implications of a respected judge engaging in such behavior. The backlash was immediate. Boyd tried to brush it off at first, thinking that, like all things on the internet, the storm would pass. But this was just a fleeting moment. It was a game changer. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. His reputation, carefully crafted over the years, was now hanging by a thread. His colleagues, the ones who once admired him, were now questioning his integrity. His peers, who knew the importance of public trust, began to distance themselves. The media latched onto the story, and soon every aspect of boydâ's life was under a microscope. His family, his career, his personal life, all of it was now at the mercy of the public's opinion. The court of public opinion was crueler than any courtroom Boyd had ever presided over. His name, once synonymous with fairness and justice, was now tainted. But even then, he refused to believe it was as bad as it seemed. He thought if he could just ride out the storm, everything would return to normal. How could a single message bring down everything he had worked for? Then came the investigation. The legal system that Boyd had once been a part of now turned against him. The courtroom, once his domain, became the very place where he was forced to face the consequences of his actions. The rules that he had upheld for so long were now the very rules he had broken. As the case developed, it became clear that the consequences were more severe than Boyd could have ever imagined. The public's anger wasn't just about the message itself. It was about the breach of trust. A judge, someone who was supposed to uphold the law, had broken the very rules he was sworn to protect. The weight of his actions was slowly sinking in. In the following weeks, boydâ's life became a blur of legal proceedings, media frenzy, and constant public scrutiny. Every move he made was analyzed, criticized, and judged. He couldn't escape it. He tried to hide from the cameras, but they followed him everywhere. Every corner of his life had been invaded, and there was no escaping the consequences of his careless mistake. The worst part? Boyd knew there was no going back. The damage was done. The reputation he had spent years building was gone in an instant, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. The community that once looked up to him now saw him as nothing more than another figure who had failed them. The trust had been broken, and it was unlikely it could ever be repaired. As the days dragged on, Boyd faced a harsh reality. His career was over. He was no longer the judge he once was. He wasn't even a respected member of the community anymore. The shame was unbearable. He had lost everything. His family, his job, his reputation, all gone, all because of one impulsive mistake. In the midst of all the chaos, Boyd had to grapple with the fact that this wasn't just a professional crisis. It was a personal one as well. He had let down the very people who had supported him the most, his family. His wife, who had stood by him through thick and thin, now looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. His children, who had once been proud of their father, now had to live with the fallout from his mistake. Boyd had always prided himself on being a role model, someone his children could look up to. But now, he was a cautionary tale. The person they once admired was now someone they feared would let them down. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and no matter how many apologies he offered, it never seemed like enough. The legal consequences were swift. The court system, which Boyd had spent his entire life working in, did not show him any leniency. The decision was made, and it was final. Boyd was sentenced to 20 years of strict consequences. The punishment was just about the message he had sent. It was about what he represented. The legal system needed to send a message that even those in positions of power were not above the law. As Boyd sat in the courtroom, hearing the verdict read aloud, he could feel the walls closing in. He had always been in control, always been the one making decisions. Now he was powerless. The weight of the sentence was more than just the years it would take from his life. It was the realization that he would never again have the chance to rebuild what he had lost. The consequences were far-reaching, and Boyd knew that the years ahead would be filled with struggle. His life, as he knew it, had been completely dismantled. The professional success he had once enjoyed was now a distant memory. The man who had once held a position of power and respect was now just another example of how one moment of weakness could bring everything crashing down. As the sentence was handed down, Boyd could only sit there in disbelief. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being a figure of authority to a man with nothing left? The journey from a respected judge to a man facing 20 years of strict consequences had been swift, and it was devastating. He would have to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. And as he left the courtroom, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of a long and difficult road ahead. The fallout from his actions would follow him for the rest of his days. Judge boydâ's world had been turned upside down, and now he was faced with the harsh reality of his consequences. The 20-year sentence, not in a physical prison, but in the form of social exile and career ruin, loomed over him like an unrelenting storm cloud. The courtroom where he had once presided now seemed like a distant memory. Boydâ's life was no longer his own. It belonged to the public, to the media, to the consequences of his own choices. The first few months were the hardest. Boyd tried to retreat into his home, away from the cameras and the whispers. But even at home, he could not escape the shame. The walls of his house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. His wife, once his greatest support, now struggled with the weight of his mistake. Their relationship was strained, every conversation laced with tension. Boyd had always believed that love and trust were the foundations of a strong family, but now he was not quite sure if either of those things could ever be fully restored. The guilt consumed him. He had ruined everything: his career, his family, his peace, his reputation. He had lost it all. There were days when he wondered if he could ever redeem himself, if he could ever live up to the person he used to be, or if this would be his legacy, a cautionary tale of a man who had it all and lost it with a single moment of indiscretion. His former colleagues, who had once respected him, now looked at him with disdain. Boyd couldn't blame them. He had let them down just as much as he had let himself down. How could they trust him again? How could he ever look them in the eye and ask for their forgiveness? It was a question that weighed heavily on him. But as time passed, Boyd began to realize that redemption was not going to come easily. It was not going to be handed to him. He would have to earn it, piece by painful piece. He couldn't change the past, but he could start taking responsibility for his actions and begin the difficult task of rebuilding. It was about regaining his position as a judge. He knew that was a dream that had died the moment he hit send on that Snapchat message. It was about reclaiming his integrity, his dignity, and his sense of self-worth. One of the first steps in boydâ's journey was to make amends with his family. His wife, though hurt and angry, was willing to listen. Slowly, they began to rebuild their relationship. It was no attempt easy. There were tears, long conversations, and many moments of doubt. But Boyd knew that if he could restore the trust of his family, he could begin to restore his own sense of purpose. Boyd also sought out therapy. He needed to understand why he had made such a careless mistake. He needed to confront the root causes of his actions. Was it a momentary lapse in judgment, or was there something deeper at play? Through therapy, Boyd began to understand the pressures that had been building up in his life. The years of stress, the expectations, and the isolation he felt as a public figure. All of these factors had contributed to his decision to send that message. It did not attempt to excuse his actions, but it helped him understand them. As Boyd worked on himself, he also began to speak publicly about his mistake. He did not do this for sympathy or attention. He did it because he knew that sharing his story might help others. He spoke about the dangers of social media, about the importance of being mindful in an age where one mistake could destroy everything. He didn't attempt to ask for forgiveness. He didn't attempt to feel he deserved it. But he knew that by sharing his story, he could help others avoid the same fate. Slowly, Boyd started to gain a measure of respect back. It wasn't the respect of his former colleagues, not yet. But it was the respect of people who saw his willingness to face the consequences of his actions, to own up to his mistake and work tirelessly to change. He wasn't perfecta, he never would be but he was trying. And in a world that often values perfection over progress, that small act of trying was a powerful thing. The years passed, and boydâ's life slowly began to take shape again. He found new work, though it was nowhere near the position he once held. He became involved in community service, working with young people to help them understand the importance of responsibility and making wise choices. His experience, though painful, had taught him valuable lessons, and he was determined to pass those lessons on to others. It was not easy, and there were still days when Boyd felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, but he had come to terms with the fact that redemption was not something that could be rushed. It was a journey, one that took time and patience. Boyd had learned that mistakes did not define him. What he did after the mistake mattered most. One day, Boyd received a letter from an old colleague. It was a simple note, offering a chance to reconnect. The letter did not contain any grand promises of forgiveness or reconciliation. But it was a step forward. It was a sign that people were beginning to see him for who he had become, not just for who he had been. And for Boyd, that was enough. It was the end of his journey, but it was a reminder that redemption, while difficult, was still possible. As he sat down to reflect on everything he had been through, Boyd realized that the most important lesson he had learned was an about the legal consequences of his actions. It was about the value of humility, the power of owning up to your mistakes, and the strength it takes to rise from the ashes. His story was no longer just about a man who lost everything. It was about a man who found a way to rebuild. It was a story of growth, of redemption, and most of all, of hope. Because no matter how far you fall, there are always a way back. If you were willing to do the hard work.